I always saw our marriage as steady, definitely not perfect, but strong in its own way. Tanya and I met back in college at a fundraiser. She was one of those nonstop volunteers, constantly busy, smiling through exhaustion, radiating this can-do spirit that people gravitated toward. I got pulled in too. She seemed like the kind of person you could build a life with. Never in a million years did I think that same selfless charm, the thing that made me fall in love, would become the wedge that tore us apart. Once we had our first child, we hit the usual hurdles: sleepless nights, money stress, the constant juggle of home and work. Tanya handled it all like a machine. She made lunches, handled PDA stuff, worked part-time as a nurse, always on the go. I did my best to help, but my hours at the dealership drained me. Eventually, the stress started to show. Tanya began drifting away, not just from me, but from the marriage. It felt like she was constantly caring for everyone else, leaving scraps of energy for us. I admired her heart, but it was like she poured herself into the world and left our relationship running on fumes. We stopped talking the way we used to. Date nights vanished. The laughter that once filled our home faded into background noise. 2 years ago, things got weirder. Tanya started staying later after shifts, blaming patience or paperwork. I didn't question it at first. She was always dedicated. But she began coming home distant, like she was somewhere else entirely. That's when the unease started creeping in. I brought it up a few times. Suggested therapy. A weekend away. Anything to reconnect. But she always brushed me off with the same line. Work's just busy right now. I wanted to believe her, but in my gut, I knew better. Then came the day she mentioned Liam, a coworker whose wife had died in some accident. She spoke about him with a softness that felt too familiar. I tried to brush it off as her being empathetic, but something didn't sit right. The real blow came a few nights later. I woke up with a splitting headache, barely made it to the bathroom before getting sick. As I crouched there, flashes of the previous day came rushing back. My name's Callahan, and yesterday, my wife told me something that shattered my world. She admitted she'd been in a relationship with Liam for a year. Said it started out as emotional support, but turned into something deep and passionate. And then she looked me in the eye and said she still loved me too. She explained, like it was no big deal, that she wasn't leaving permanently. She just planned to stay with Liam for now, until he didn't need her anymore. All while keeping up the facade of being a wife and mom at home. I was speechless. Furious. I snapped and said things I regret. But instead of apologizing, Tanya doubled down. She accused me of neglect, of failing to live up to my role. Said if I really loved her, I'd understand. Still in shock, I turned to alcohol. Once I sobered up, I asked how she'd react if I found someone else. She laughed in my face. Who'd want you? She scoffed. Called me an out-of-shape, balding, washed-up man. Then she warned me, if I filed for divorce, I'd be ruined emotionally and financially. We argued until she grabbed a bag and stormed out to his place. The next morning, I stared at my reflection and knew she wasn't wrong about everything. I was middle-aged, soft around the edges, hair thinning. I couldn't rewind time, but I could take control of the present. First, I needed to know where the kids were. I searched the house. Nothing. Just as I reached for the phone to call her parents, Tanya's car pulled into the driveway. The kids stepped out quietly. Tanya followed them in and immediately took a jab at my hangover. No concern, just venom. When I asked where the kids had been, she casually said they'd slept at Liam's house. I asked why not her parents. She shrugged. They weren't home. She brushed past me like I didn't matter. I asked, are you staying or going back to him? She sighed like I was the one being unreasonable. I've told you, I love you, but I'm staying with him for now. And the kids? I asked. If you don't want them, call my parents, she said, emotionless, before packing another bag and walking out. I stood there, trying to keep it together for the kids. I wouldn't let her betrayal break me. I still had my pride. After she left, I checked in on the kids. Asked about homework. They groaned but agreed to do it once I promised we'd head to their grandparents' place later. Tanya's parents own a small farm just outside town. Her dad, Frank, is a retired handyman with a workshop full of tools. The kids love it there, especially the go-karts Frank's been helping them build. He's more than just their grandpa. He's a teacher, a safe place, someone they can count on. As I watched them work with him, I thought about how much they mattered. Ethan, my oldest, is 16, lives for football, even if he's not scholarship material. Chloe, 15, is sharp, rebellious but driven. Noah, the youngest at 11, was our surprise baby, Tanya's favorite, though he hates being called that. His bright personality is a rare light these days. Back at the house, I poured a cup of coffee and made a to-do list. First call? My boss, Martin Doyle. I've been at the local Ford dealership for 23 years. Martin's been running the place for 15 of those. He's always been fair with me, and I needed that kind of stability now more than ever. When I told Martin what had happened, he didn't hesitate. He offered his support immediately, like he'd been waiting for the chance to help. You're not alone in this, Eric, he said, his voice calm but firm. Then he shared a story about his son's nasty divorce, a messy situation involving false abuse claims, and a dramatic intervention by the ex-mother-in-law, of all people. Apparently, she'd threatened to testify against her own daughter to stop the lies. That's brutal, I said, taken aback. Brutal doesn't even begin to cover it, Martin replied. But if she hadn't stepped in, my son would have been destroyed. Martin told me to take as much time off as I needed. I asked for a week, and he approved it on the spot, even offering to cover for me if anything came up at the dealership. Before we hung up, I asked if he knew a good divorce attorney, someone who wouldn't hold back. Without skipping a beat, he gave me a name, Jonas Reed. Reed's a shark, Martin said. He got my son full custody and even managed to get child support from the ex-wife. If you want someone who'll go to war for you, he's your guy. A flicker of hope sparked. For the first time in days, I felt like I had a direction. Martin rummaged through his office drawer and eventually read off Reed's number from an old business card. I figured I'd leave a message, it was Saturday, after all, but decided to call anyway. To my surprise, someone answered. Reed's secretary said he'd just had a cancellation. If you can be here in 30 minutes, he'll see you, she said. I gave the kids a quick rundown, told them to stay out of trouble while I stepped out for a bit, then jumped in the car and headed over. I made it in under 20 minutes. Reed's office was modern but not flashy. He came out to greet me himself, mid-30s, clean-cut, smart dresser. A little shorter than me, with sharp blue eyes and a polished confidence that probably played well in courtrooms. Especially in front of juries. Especially female ones. Once we sat down, he cut right to the chase. What brings you in today? I took a deep breath. Yesterday, my wife told me she's been cheating on me, with a younger guy. Saying it out loud made my chest tighten. My face flushed with a mix of rage and shame. I gave him the rundown, trying to keep it brief without glossing over the important stuff. Reed listened closely, scribbling notes as I talked. When I got to the part where Tanya told me she still loved me, but was going to keep seeing the other man anyway, he held up a hand. Let me get this straight, he said, leaning forward, his face darkening. She says she loves you, but plans to keep sleeping with someone else? I nodded, ashamed. He blinked slowly. Go on. I told him about the argument, how Tanya blew up when I didn't go along with her twisted plan. I admitted I lost my temper, said some things I shouldn't have. I also told him how she laughed in my face when I asked what she'd do if I found someone else. And how she went even further, mocking me, calling me undesirable, saying no one would want a washed-up, balding middle-aged man like me. Then came the financial threats. If I divorced her, she'd ruin me. She actually said that? Reed asked, eyebrows raised. No offense, but your wife either lacks empathy completely, or she's got deeper issues than you realize. None taken, I said with a sigh. I've been asking myself the same thing. I told him how she'd taken the kids to stay at her lover's place after the fight. That got his attention. His pen paused mid-sentence before he made a quick note. Well then, he said, lacing his fingers together. Let's talk strategy. What do you want to do here? I stared at the floor for a moment. I can't live like this, I finally said. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive her. But I know I can't let her drag me down or take my kids with her. Reed nodded slowly, like he'd heard this before. That's more common than you think, he said. But here's the good news. I'll fight to make sure you're protected. If this goes to divorce court, you're entitled to at least half of the marital assets. Maybe more, depending on how we play it. Then came the part one wasn't ready for. But, he said, I need you to understand something. Courts don't care about infidelity. It's not a factor when dividing assets or deciding custody, unless it directly affects the children. My stomach dropped. So I might still have to pay alimony? Child support. It's possible, Reed said. But here's the thing, your wife left the marital home. And worse, she brought your kids to another man's house overnight. Judges don't like that. Right now, you have physical custody, and that gives us an edge. If we can secure primary custody for you, there's a chance you won't owe child support. Then he asked, does she work? Yeah, I replied. Part-time at the hospital. Just 3 days a week, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Honestly, that's probably where she met the guy. Reed nodded. And her income? About $25,000 a year, I said. I make around $80,000. He gave a small nod, face turning serious. Okay. Now I need you to really think about this next question. Do you still love her? Do you want to save this marriage? The room went silent. I looked down again. My hands were clenched in my lap. When I looked up, my face was wet with tears. I do, I whispered. But I can't go back to this. I love her, but I can't live with what she's done. She tore our marriage apart and doesn't even seem sorry. I want a divorce. Understood, Reed said, flipping to a new page. Let's talk finances. What do you and your wife own together? I took a moment to tally things up. We've got about $3,500 in checking, $44,000 in savings, and a $20,000 CD. My 401k is sitting at around $150,000. Tanya has a retirement account too, though it's smaller since she's only worked part-time the last few years. Back when she was full-time, though, the hospital had better benefits, so she might have a decent package tucked away. Reed wrote everything down quickly, already shifting gears in his mind. All right, he said. That gives us a good starting point. Surprisingly, it turned out my company's health insurance plan was better than the hospital's, so that's what we used to cover the whole family. I hesitated for a moment before adding, we also have 2 cars, both in both our names, and then there's the house. We bought it a few years back with a loan stretched to the limit, so we haven't built much equity yet. Jonas nodded, his demeanor shifting into full business mode. There was a focused, almost surgical precision in the way he spoke now. Here's what I need you to do, he said, tapping his pen. Withdraw half of the money from your checking and savings accounts. Move it into a new account that's in your name only. I can't touch the CD, I pointed out. It's joint, and cashing it out needs Tanya's signature. That's fine, Jonas replied, doing mental math on the spot. Take $33,750 from savings. Use what's left in checking to pay off as many of the household bills as possible, utilities, mortgage, groceries, anything that shows you're maintaining the home. He looked up. Also, cancel any joint credit cards immediately. Pay off their balances if you can, then apply for one in your name only. I actually still have a personal card I opened before we got married, I told him. Barely use it, though. The joint one gave us better cash back. That's even better, he said with a faint smile. Use it moving forward. It keeps things clean. He scribbled a checklist onto a notepad, ripped it off, and handed it to me. Before you leave, stop at my secretary's desk. Have her call Taylor Locksmith to change the locks at your place. Once that's squared away, come back and I'll go over the next legal steps. I nodded and stepped out. Miss Carlson, his secretary, was already dialing as I gave her the address. They said someone would be at the house before noon. Feeling a little more grounded, I returned to Jonas's office. He was just hanging up another call. Good news, he said. If I fax the documents today, we can get Judge Johnson assigned to your case. I blinked. And that's good because... Jonas grinned like he'd been waiting to explain. Johnson's old school. Deep Bible Belt roots. He hates adultery, doesn't care who committed it. That's a huge advantage for us. Plus, he and my father were close friends. He won't mind if I give him a personal call. He stood, extending his hand again. I shook it, grateful. Handle the banking today, he said. I'll draft a petition for an emergency restraining order. If the judge grants it, Tanya won't be allowed near you or the kids or even the house. The fact that she left her children at another man's home overnight? That helps our case, big time. I nodded slowly, letting it sink in. Even if the order gets dismissed later, it'll give you a window of time to establish yourself as the kid's primary caregiver. By Friday, she'll be served with divorce papers. After that, we'll see how she reacts. For the first time since Tanya dropped that bombshell on me, I felt the tiniest flicker of power returning. Not revenge. Not triumph. Just dignity. At the bank, things went smoothly. I withdrew my half as a cashier's check and closed our joint credit card. The remaining balance, $537, I paid off directly from the checking account. Then I used another $2,600 to pay 2 months' worth of mortgage payments in advance. Once done, I deposited the check into new checking and savings accounts, just mine, at a different bank. When I got back home, the kids were still sprawled on the couch, glued to the TV. Come on, I told them. We're heading to your grandparents'. They perked up. Moments later, we were in the car, on our way to the farm. As we pulled into the driveway, Frank was stepping out from behind his workshop. He gave us a wave and disappeared inside again. The kids jumped out and ran after him. Inside the house, Diane greeted me with her usual warmth and a kiss on the cheek. A moment later, Frank reappeared, freshly washed up and ready for a chat. I cleared my throat. I need to tell you something difficult, I began. Tanya's been having an affair, and I've decided to file for divorce. Frank's face hardened instantly. No, he snapped. That can't be true. Tanya would never. She told me herself, I said, barely above a whisper. I could feel my throat tightening. Just then, the back door creaked open, and the kids came thundering in, laughing and tracking dirt on the floor. Outside, I said quickly. Give me a few more minutes. Why? Ethan asked, a bit too sharply. Because I said so, I replied, my tone harsher than I intended. But when he looked at me, his eyes caught the tears in mine. Without another word, he nodded and led his siblings back out. Tanya admitted this? Diane asked, her voice trembling. Yes, I said, more firmly this time. And it's worse than just an affair. I laid it all out, the late nights, the emotional detachment, the affair, the cold way she mocked me. I told them how she belittled me, threatened to ruin me, and laughed when I mentioned the idea of being with someone else. Then I explained how she left the kids at her lover's place overnight like it was no big deal. Diane sat in stunned silence. Frank clenched his fists and muttered, I still can't believe this. Then, without another word, he pulled out his phone. I'm calling her. Now. And I'm putting it on speaker. He tapped her name and set the phone on the coffee table. Hi, Dad. Tanya's voice rang out, cheerful and oblivious. What's going on? She asked. Eric's here with me, Frank began, voice steady but serious. And I have a question. Are you having an affair? There was silence on the line. For several long seconds, no one said anything. Finally, Tanya spoke, her tone instantly defensive. What did he say? He told me you're seeing someone else, Frank replied calmly. That you've been intimate with him, and that you've said you love him. It's not what you think, Tanya said, her voice trembling. Dad, he's been through so much. I'm just trying to help. I couldn't abandon him. Frank's jaw clenched. His face flushed with anger. Answer the question, Tanya. Are you sleeping with him? There was a pause. Yes, she admitted, softly. But I love Eric too. I can't walk away from this other man. He needs me. I care about him deeply. I sat frozen. Hearing her say it out loud, not just to me, but to her parents, was surreal. Frank looked like someone had gut-punched him. He'd always seen Tanya as his golden child. And now, the truth was out. I never expected Frank to actually call Tanya out. But he did. Tanya, he said, his voice thick with disbelief and disappointment, I never thought I'd see the day my daughter would act like this. I raised you better than that. Please, Daddy, she started, her voice cracking. But Frank didn't let her finish. With a tight jaw, he ended the call with a sharp tap and set the phone down. The silence that followed was heavy until the phone rang again. Diane moved to pick it up, but Frank stopped her with a hard glare. Don't answer it. She hesitated, then defied him and picked it up anyway. Frank's face twisted with fury. In one swift motion, he snatched the phone from her hand and hurled it into the stone fireplace, where it shattered on impact. I said, leave it alone, he bellowed. Diane stepped back, clearly shaken. I sat frozen, stunned by the raw intensity in the room. The energy shifted, everything felt heavier, quieter. Frank's chest rose and fell rapidly as he tried to get a grip. After a long, tense pause, he turned toward me. The anger in his eyes faded, replaced by grief. Then, unexpectedly, he pulled me into a hug. Eric, he said, his voice thick and hoarse, I am so sorry. I don't even know what to say. I can't believe Tanya's done this to you. He held onto my shoulder for a moment longer, like he was anchoring himself. We're here for you. You and the kids, whatever you need. He glanced at Diane. She can talk to Tanya later. Right now, I can't. I'm too damn angry. I nodded quietly, thanked them both, and loaded the kids back into the car. I hugged Frank and Diane goodbye and invited them over for dinner, told them we'd talk more then. On the drive home, the silence in the car was fragile. Then Chloe's voice broke it, soft and shaky. Are you and Mom getting divorced? She asked. I flinched. Who told you that? I did, Ethan said from the back seat. I went back inside and heard you talking. I knew something was wrong. I just didn't think it was this. I sighed deeply, the weight of it all pressing harder on my chest. Tanya's betrayal wasn't just cutting into me, it was hitting our kids, too. She probably hadn't even considered them when she decided to dive into her affair. It looks like your mom and I are headed that way, I said gently. But why? Noah asked, his small voice cracking as tears welled in his eyes. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror, struggling to find words that made sense without tearing their world further apart. Your mom has developed feelings for someone else, I said carefully. You mean she's sleeping with another guy? Chloe blurted, her voice filled with anger. I hate her. She's awful. Hey, I said, more out of reflex than belief. Don't talk about your mom like that. But the words felt hollow. The truth was, I did share her rage. I just couldn't let it spill over and poison them more. When we arrived home, the locksmith had just finished changing the locks. Not long after, Tanya's car screeched into the driveway. She slammed the door and stormed up to the house, eyes wild with rage. So you went crying to my parents? She snapped as she barged inside. What did you tell them? That I'm some kind of tramp? My voice came out low, but firm. I told them the truth. She scoffed, her hands on her hips. And for what it's worth, I continued, I do still love you. Or at least, I did. But I will never, never accept sharing you with someone else. You've shattered my trust, destroyed my dignity, and tossed away everything we built. I took a breath, voice trembling. Do you even realize how much it hurt when you called me some sad, overweight man who should feel lucky to have you? That was beyond cruel. Tanya faltered. Her expression cracked for a moment. I didn't mean it like that, she said, stumbling over her words. I was angry, and you said awful things to me too. You're my husband. I'm the mother of your children. If you loved me, you'd understand. She looked at me like I was the one being unreasonable. I'm not leaving you for him, she went on. I just care about him. He's going through something hard, and I want to help. He's young, and I know he'll move on eventually. I stared at her, shaking my head. You keep using the word help, but you forget the part of our vows that said faithful. Helping someone doesn't mean crawling into bed with them. Her eyes filled with tears, but I felt no sympathy. That well had run dry. Yes, Tanya, I said. I've accepted this, accepted exactly who you are now. And you're no longer part of my life. That's the truth you need to start living with. For a split second, she looked fragile, almost ashamed. But then her face hardened, and that smug superiority crept back in. She straightened her spine and spoke with that condescending tone she often used with the kids. Stop being a fool, Eric. I'm your wife. You know me. I love you. Once this man gets through his crisis, I'll come back to you. The shift in me was instant. No, Tanya, I said coldly. I don't know you. The woman I married was kind and loyal. You? You're a stranger. And honestly, how do I even know this is the first time? For all I know, you've been hopping into the arms of every guy with a sob story. Her face turned crimson. She stepped closer, nostrils flaring. This is not an affair, she hissed. This is the only time I've slept with someone since we got married. And I'm not abandoning him. He needs me, and I'm going to be there whether you like it or not. Do whatever you want, I replied, voice cold. But don't expect me to pretend this is okay. And since I can't believe a single word out of your mouth anymore, I'll be arranging DNA tests for the kids. Her jaw dropped. You're a disgusting bastard, she spat. You're really going to put our kids through that? You're going to destroy their trust in me. I met her fury with silence, then said quietly, you already did that. I'm just trying to find the truth. You want to play hardball? She snapped. Fine. Just remember, I warned you what would happen if you pushed for divorce. You'll lose everything. I shook my head and stepped toward the porch. I'd rather lose it all and live broke in a trailer than spend one more day with someone who has no conscience. Before she could launch her next attack, a sheriff's cruiser pulled up to the curb. A deputy stepped out and walked toward us, clipboard in hand. Are you Tanya Jameson? He asked. She blinked, caught off guard. Yes, I am. He held out a document. Ma'am, this is a restraining order. You're prohibited from entering this home or coming within 500 feet of your husband or children. Do you understand? Tanya's face went pale. Her eyes darted from the deputy to me. But this is my house, she protested. My things are in there. The deputy didn't budge. You'll be allowed 15 minutes to collect your personal belongings, the deputy said, glancing at me for confirmation. I gave him a quiet nod. Officer, would it be okay if I took my kids to the backyard while she's inside? I asked. I want to see my children, Tanya interrupted, her voice cracking with desperation. Ma'am, the deputy replied, his tone flat and professional, the protective order includes your children. You'll need to abide by its terms. Tanya's expression twisted. She spun toward me, her face a picture of outrage. This is your doing, she yelled, pointing a trembling finger. You're trying to take my kids away from me. I didn't flinch. No, Tanya. You did this, I replied calmly. You walked away from your home, from me, and from our children. You left them at your lover's house while you stayed with him. I simply told the court the truth. She screamed in frustration, her voice shrill. I didn't abandon anyone. He's a wonderful man. He cares about them. If he's such a wonderful man, I said coldly, then go be with him. But don't expect any pity from me, or the court. I turned and led the kids into the backyard, doing my best to explain that their mom would be inside briefly to gather some of her things for her new place. I promised they could say goodbye before she left. When the moment came, Noah immediately broke down. He ran to her sobbing uncontrollably and clung to her legs. Please don't leave, Mommy, he cried. Tears streamed down Tanya's face as she knelt to hug him. Then she looked up at me, voice trembling. Eric, can't you see what this is doing to them? I clenched my jaw. Don't you dare put this on me, I said, my voice like steel. You brought this into their lives. You took them to another man's home. You made that decision, not me. But I can't just abandon him, she cried. He's going through so much. He needs me. I stared at her, my eyes sharp. You already abandoned someone. You abandoned your husband, your kids, and your home the second you chose him. That was your choice. Now live with the consequences. I hope it was worth it. Ethan had been standing nearby, silent and stiff. He looked at her like he didn't recognize her anymore. Why? He finally asked, his voice barely audible. Tanya fumbled for words, but nothing she said could change what had already happened. Then Chloe stormed up from behind me, eyes blazing. You're so selfish, she hissed through clenched teeth. Her cheeks were streaked with tears. And before I could stop her, she spat, right at her mother. Chloe, I yelled, grabbing her by the shoulders and pulling her back. Apologize, I demanded, my voice firm. No, she snapped, staring daggers at her mother. I meant it. Tanya collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. The raw emotion spilling out of her did nothing to move me. I wasn't surprised by Chloe's outburst. Their relationship had been rocky for a while, and Tanya's betrayal might have just shattered it for good. Still holding Chloe, I watched as Tanya got to her feet, wiped her face, and bolted for her car. She slammed the door and drove off, pounding her fists against the steering wheel in what looked like sheer desperation. Mommy, don't go. Noah screamed, trying to run after her. Ethan caught him just in time, holding him tightly as he cried into his chest. I walked over and put a hand on Ethan's shoulder. He didn't speak, just nodded. The deputy came over, his expression soft with sympathy. Mr. Callahan. I'm sorry this is happening. I nodded, unable to respond. My throat was tight. There were no words for what this had become. My family had cracked down the middle, and no amount of glue could put it back together. That evening, Frank and Diane came over for dinner. I had planned something simple, just hamburgers and a salad, but Diane waved me off and went straight into the kitchen. She made her signature meatloaf with macaroni and cheese, the kids' favorite. It was her way of nurturing through the chaos. While she cooked, Frank and I sat in the living room with a couple of beers. He looked tired, like the weight of his daughter's actions was crushing him. I updated him on the restraining order, explaining why I'd filed it. When I told him Tanya had left the kids unattended at her lover's house, his shoulders slumped. After a long silence, he finally spoke. Diane talked to Tanya about an hour after you left, he said, rubbing his temples. I leaned forward. And he shook his head slowly. It was bad. Diane tried to be calm, tried to reason with her. But Tanya wouldn't hear it. She kept saying we're all wrong, that we don't understand. She's convinced she's the victim. I muttered. Worse, Frank said. She called us toxic and manipulative. That's when Diane snapped. I've never seen her so angry. She told Tanya not to call us again. And she said if this goes to court, she'll testify against her. I exhaled deeply. Good. Dinner was quiet. The only real moment of light came when Frank asked the kids if they wanted to work on their go-karts the next day. Noah and Ethan lit up, and for a second, I saw a flicker of the joy we used to have. Chloe, however, sat motionless, pushing her food around with her fork. I didn't press her. She was carrying her own kind of grief, and I had to let her move through it at her own pace. Later that week, on Friday, Tanya was officially served with divorce papers, right at her job. I wasn't there, but a nurse friend told me her reaction was nuclear. She screamed at the process server in front of everyone, vowing to ruin me. Hospital management sent her home. The word was she didn't go to her own place. She went straight to her lover's. Shortly after, she hired a lawyer, Danielle Price. Jonas knew her well. Apparently, They'd gone up against each other several times. She's arrogant, he told me. Thinks she's a star in the courtroom, but honestly, she's overrated. All posture, no punch. Danielle's first move was an attempt to get the restraining order tossed out. She argued it was extreme, claimed Tanya wasn't a danger. Judge Johnson wasn't having it. The children are safe where they are, he said curtly before denying her request. He did agree to one minor change. Tanya would be allowed supervised visitation at the house. But under no circumstances could her boyfriend come within 500 feet of the property. It wasn't a win. It was a warning shot. The judge gave Tanya a sharp warning. If her boyfriend came anywhere near the kids again, her visitation rights would be revoked without further discussion. She seemed oddly satisfied with the small victory of being allowed visits, but her smugness didn't last long. In the very next breath, the judge ordered her to pay child support, and not just some token amount, enough that she'd have to go back to full-time nursing to afford it. I knew her hospital would take her back despite the drama. Nurses were in short supply, and for all her personal flaws, Tanya had always been good at her job. Around that same time, the DNA test results arrived in the mail. I stared at the envelope for hours, the weight of it heavier than I'd imagined. It took me most of the afternoon to work up the courage to open it. When I finally did, the air left my lungs. All 3 kids, mine. Biologically, undeniably mine. I read the report 3 times just to be sure. Each time, the same results stared back at me. Relief washed over me like a tidal wave. But then I sat there, thinking, what if it had been different? And in that still moment, I realized something profound. It wouldn't have changed how I felt about them. Not one bit. These kids were my whole world, and no test could alter that. They were my children. Always had been. Always would be. Still, even with that peace in my heart, there was no forgiving Tanya. Not for what she'd done. Not for how she'd done it. I couldn't allow someone like her to shape the minds and values of our children. She had blown up our lives without a second thought and expected grace in return. Once my vacation and personal days ran out, Frank and Diane stepped up without hesitation. They agreed to watch the kids so I could return to work, even as they continued to refuse any communication with Tanya. She called 3 or 4 times a day for about a week, Frank told me over dinner one night. Eventually, I just blocked her. With the attorneys now handling communication, a structured visitation schedule was put in place. Tanya was granted short, court-approved visits, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday evenings from 6 to 7, with Diane supervising. I made it clear I'd be there for the first visit. I wasn't about to risk a scene in front of the kids. That Monday, a car I didn't recognize pulled up outside the house. Tanya stepped out wearing a forced smile. I didn't need to ask whose car it was. "Hi, Eric. How are you?" "Mother," she said, trying to sound polite. "It's nice to see you." I stepped out onto the porch. "Tanya," I said sharply, "you need to leave." The judge was very clear. Your boyfriend is not allowed within 500 feet of this house. Panic flickered in her eyes. "He was just dropping me off," she stammered. "He's already leaving. Are you out of your mind?" I snapped. "That's still a violation. If he doesn't leave now, I'll report it." She turned on her heel and rushed back to the car. I watched as she leaned into the passenger window, speaking quickly. While she did, I jotted down the license plate. The car sped off seconds later. "He'll pick me up later," she said with a hint of defiance as she returned. "Then tell him to wait at the end of the street," I replied. "I don't want him anywhere near this house, and if he so much as pulls into this driveway again, I will call the sheriff." Her face turned red, and her hands balled into fists at her sides. "Eric, I'm sick of being treated like a criminal. You had no right to take money from our account or shut down my credit card." I stared at her, expressionless. "I didn't take anything that wasn't mine. That money paid off the credit card we both used and covered 2 months of mortgage payments on my back, while you were playing house with your boyfriend. As for the card," I added, "I wasn't going to let you keep racking up charges at restaurants and hotels while I stayed here raising our kids. You made your choices. Now deal with the fallout." Her jaw clenched. "This isn't an affair," she snapped. "And he's not my lover. You're just being a—" Before she could finish, Diane stepped forward with a quiet fury I hadn't seen before and slapped Tanya hard across the face. The sound echoed through the porch like a firecracker. Tanya stumbled back, stunned. Diane's voice was low and cold. "You ever insult Eric again, and I swear I will drag you out of that dress myself. You're lucky I'm letting you see the kids at all." She pointed toward the front door. They're in the living room. Go see them. I need a word with Eric, and then I'll come in. But listen carefully. You so much as raise your voice in that house, I'll personally throw you out." Tanya nodded quickly, face burning, and walked into the house with her shoulders hunched. Once she was out of earshot, Diane turned to me. "Eric, I'm sorry," she said. "I don't know what's gotten into her. She's not the girl I raised. It's like she's lost her damn mind." I nodded. "Thanks for standing up for me." 2 weeks later, just as Jonas predicted, the restraining order was lifted. But by that point, I'd firmly established myself as the children's primary caregiver, and the court allowed me to remain in the family home. Tanya was still required to pay child support and could now see the kids in public spaces without supervision, but the judge held firm on one rule. Her boyfriend was not allowed anywhere near the children, nor could she bring them to his home under any circumstance. Finally, after months of delays, we had our first official court date to finalize the divorce. Before anything got started, Judge Johnson asked if either of us had attended counseling. Neither of us had. So he ordered 8 mandatory sessions before the case could move forward. I didn't object. I knew it would be useless, but I figured it couldn't hurt. Tanya, however, looked like she thought it was her big chance, an opportunity to spin her story and gain sympathy from a professional. In our first session with Julia Benton, the court-appointed therapist, Tanya did exactly what I expected. She hijacked the entire hour, painting herself as some noble figure, claiming her affair had been a Christian act of compassion. I sat there stunned as she tried to rewrite the narrative to make herself sound like a saint. Julia didn't say much that first session, just nodded, asked questions, and listened. But by the second session, something changed. Julia started gently pushing back. "Let me ask you this," Julia said, leaning forward slightly in her chair. "Would it be acceptable if Eric decided to start a sexual relationship with another woman?" I braced myself for the usual blow-up, expecting Tanya to jump in, ready to attack me. But she didn't say anything. Not right away. That silence, her hesitation, said everything. But at that point, I didn't even care what her answer was. As the divorce process dragged on, I poured my energy into something I could control, myself. After everything Tanya said about my looks, that I was just some pathetic, balding middle-aged man, I was determined to prove her wrong. I booked a hair transplant. It wasn't a huge operation, but it still cost me around $4,000. I was nervous at first, not sure how I'd feel walking around with a buzzed head and tiny red scabs dotting my scalp. But since I was already on leave, I figured there was no better time to get it done. The surgeon took hair from the back of my head and grafted it to the thinning areas in the front. The first week, I stayed inside, hiding out while my scalp healed. The kids were curious, of course. I told them I'd had a minor procedure and left it at that. By day 10, I started to look like myself again. A few weeks later, the new hair began blending in, and I realized this wasn't just cosmetic. It was psychological. I felt different, stronger. Then I doubled down. I started running. At first, even half a mile left me wheezing, legs burning, drenched in sweat. But I stuck with it. Day by day, I pushed a little farther. Eventually, I could run 10 miles without stopping. I joined a gym. I cleared our kitchen of all the garbage food. No more pizza, no more chips, no more late-night ice cream. The kids whined at first. Chloe nearly staged a protest when I tossed her sour cream and onion Pringles. But I made it fun. We tried new recipes, looked up healthy hacks online, and turned it into a family event. Some meals were a disaster. I burned a clean lasagna so badly it fused to the dish. But we laughed about it, scraped together some sandwiches, and tried again the next night. Cooking together gave us something to look forward to. It reminded me that even though Tanya had wrecked our home, there was still something solid left, me and the kids. Going back to work gave me a confidence boost I hadn't expected. On my first day back at the dealership, Trudy at the front desk looked me up and down. "Welcome back, Eric," she said. "You look different." I laughed, slightly embarrassed. "Been running. Dropped 18 pounds so far." She grinned. "Well, it suits you. If I wasn't married, I'd be all over you." I laughed again, awkward but flattered. "According to Tanya, I'm still just a washed-up nobody," I said. She needed something younger, I guess. Trudy's smile vanished. "Eric, don't let her garbage get in your head. You're a great guy. There are plenty of women who'd be lucky to have you." That was the first real compliment I'd received in months. And for the first time in a long time, I felt seen. Not pitted. Not scolded. Just appreciated. At our next therapy session, Julia turned to Tanya. How would you feel if Eric came home and told you he was having an affair? Tanya paused, then said, if he was helping someone recover from a tragedy. I guess I'd be okay with it. Julia didn't stop. And if he said he loved her? That their sexual relationship was fulfilling? Tanya's expression hardened. As long as he took care of me and the kids, I could accept that. It was absurd. I sat there stunned as Julia patiently dismantled Tanya's warped logic. No matter what angle Julia came at, Tanya refused to admit fault. It wasn't therapy to her, it was a stage. One more place to defend the indefensible. But slowly, something shifted. As time passed, the sharp edge of her betrayal dulled. I stopped caring about her excuses, stopped wasting energy trying to understand someone who clearly didn't care to be understood. By the third week of counseling, Tanya arrived looking different, quieter, more subdued. She barely spoke during the session, only listening as Julia picked apart her earlier justifications. She avoided direct eye contact, but I caught her sneaking glances at me when she thought I wasn't paying attention. By then, I had lost even more weight. The time I spent working outside had given me a healthy tan. I didn't just feel different, I looked different. Stronger, happier, free. But long before the court-mandated therapy, I'd already started carving a new path. The dealership job had worn me down for years. I liked fixing cars, especially bodywork, but I hated the pressure, the quotas, the paperwork. My passion had always been restoration. Ever since I was 14, I dreamed of owning my own shop. I brought the idea to Frank. He didn't hesitate. You can use my barn, he said. We'll convert it. I've got tools. Hell, if it goes well, we'll build something bigger on my land. I didn't have the money to quit my job outright, so I eased in gradually. I used some of the money I'd withdrawn from our joint savings and took a small loan from Frank. Together, we bought equipment, set up the space, and even built a paint booth. I worked evenings and weekends at the barn, juggling my day job with side clients. Word spread. The community needed a guy like me, affordable, honest, and damn good at what I did. The kids loved it. Ethan learned to do oil changes. Chloe picked up engine basics and wasn't shy about bragging to her friends. Even Noah got into it, handing me tools and asking questions. One weekend, the dealership called to ask if I could work overtime. I looked at my calendar, already booked solid with private clients. So I made a decision. I knocked on Martin's office door. Got a minute? I asked. Sure, Eric, Martin said, motioning me into his office. Glad you're on board this weekend. We've got 44 vehicles arriving Friday, and they all need to be prepped and moved before the end of the month. I felt a knot form in my gut. He was expecting me to help, to be the reliable employee I'd always been, but I had to stand firm. That's actually why I came in, I said, my voice steady. I won't be able to work this weekend. I've started a side business, and I need to honor my commitments to my own customers. Martin's expression hardened. Eric, if you can't help out, I might have to let you go. I nodded. I'd prepared for this. I understand, Martin. No hard feelings. I'm doing this for my kids. I want to build something lasting for their future. I'll go clean out my locker. He sighed, rubbing his temples. I hate to lose you, Eric. You've been solid for years. He looked up again. Tell me more about your shop. What kind of work are you doing? Where are you set up? I gave him a rundown, how I was working out of Frank's converted barn, what equipment I had, the kind of body work I specialized in, and how business was already starting to pick up. Martin listened closely, his face thoughtful. Then he surprised me. Grab a coffee and come back in 15, he said, reaching for his phone. I didn't get coffee. I went to pack up my locker, fully expecting it would be my last time there. Losing the job would hit our finances hard, but I believed in the shop, and I was already earning more on the side than I'd expected. I'd also taken Tanya off my insurance plan, so the kids would be switching to hers. I was handling things, piece by piece. When I returned to his office, Martin greeted me with a smile and slid a piece of paper across the desk. I've got a proposal for you, he said. This is a contractor agreement. I still need you this weekend, and I think your customers can wait a few days. If your shop passes inspection, I'll hire you as an independent contractor to handle all our body work. I was stunned, not just by the offer, but by the fact that Martin believed in me. I signed the contract. That weekend, I finished my work at the dealership and hustled to grow my business on evenings and Sundays. Within weeks, I was running my shop full-time. I still helped Martin when he needed me, but I was no longer his employee. I was a business owner. Frank joined me part-time in the shop, and Diane took over bookkeeping. For the first time in my life, I was earning more money than I ever had working for someone else. It wasn't just income. It was freedom. The only part of my life still in ruins was my marriage. By the fourth counseling session, I felt absolutely nothing for Tanya. I didn't care about her boyfriend, didn't care about her justifications. It still stung to imagine her in someone else's arms, but the sting didn't last long anymore. She, on the other hand, was still locked in her fantasy world. In one session, Julia turned to Tanya and asked plainly, "How would you feel if Eric came home and told you he was in a relationship with another woman?" Tanya paused, then said with irritating confidence, "If he was helping her through something, I'd understand." Julia pressed, "What if he told you he loved her? That they were intimate and fulfilled?" Tanya lifted her chin. "As long as he made sure the kids and I were provided for, I could accept that." Julia spent the rest of the session breaking apart Tanya's logic, but it was like trying to reason with a brick wall. She just doubled down, as always. These sessions weren't about healing for her. They were about rewriting the narrative so she could keep living in denial. I was done trying to fix anything. The deeper truth had settled in. Love, even when once genuine, dies when left untended. If you ignore it, take it for granted, it fades. And with Tanya, it had vanished. So I focused on my kids, on my work, on me. And with every passing week, I felt stronger. During our fifth session, I decided to speak up about the one thing that had hurt me the most. I wasn't going to let it fester. When Julia opened the floor, I turned to Tanya, my voice calm but filled with hurt. "Tanya," I said, "I've realized something. You're not just selfish, you're cruel." She blinked, taken aback. "How could you look at the man you once promised to love and tell him he's a washed-up, middle-aged loser who could never attract another woman? You said I should feel lucky to have you." That cut me deeper than you could ever imagine. Tanya's face crumpled. She burst into tears. "Oh, Eric. I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "I hate that I said those things. I hate myself for it. I wish I could take it all back. I love you." I stared at her, unmoved. "Not enough to stop sleeping with your boyfriend," I replied coldly. "Save your apologies. You'll need them more than I will." She broke down completely. Julia tried to calm her, but she was inconsolable. Eventually, Julia ended the session and handed us a packet of homework. The questions were personal. What's your relationship like with your parents? How is your physical intimacy? Then came one that stopped me cold. If you could change one thing about yourself or your relationship, what would it be? That night, I sat at the kitchen table, pen hovering above the paper. I stared at that question for a long time. Eventually, I wrote, "If I could change one thing, I wish I had been a better husband so my wife wouldn't have fallen out of love with me." At our next session, we handed in the homework, but Julia didn't look through it right away. Instead, she asked if we had anything we wanted to bring up. "I do," I said, not hesitating. Julia gave me the nod to continue. I turned and looked directly at Tanya. "These sessions aren't going anywhere. Let's not waste more time. You've made it clear you're not leaving your friend, Liam Granger. That leaves no room for reconciliation. Why don't we stop pretending and move forward with the divorce?" Tanya's eyes went wide, her face paling. "How do you know his name?" she whispered. I held her gaze. "The first day you came to see the kids, I saw his license plate. It didn't take much to figure out who he was. But his name doesn't matter," I said, my voice steady. "I don't care about him. I'm not looking for revenge. I just want to move on with my life." Tanya's expression faltered. For a fleeting moment, I saw something raw behind her eyes, pain, maybe even regret. And for a second, it hit me harder than I expected. But I didn't move. I didn't reach out. I knew it wouldn't change anything. "I also know your lawyer isn't thrilled with the proposed settlement," I continued, pulling us back to business. "So I've instructed my attorney to revise the terms. I'm willing to extend your visitation time with the kids. I'm also offering $1,000 a month in alimony for the next 3 years. Her eyes widened slightly. "All I want is closure," I said. "An end to this mess. That's it." She looked devastated, genuinely crushed. But no matter how shattered she appeared in that chair, the reality hadn't changed. She was never going to leave Liam. I had long since accepted the one truth she kept trying to pretend didn't matter. I could never, ever live in a marriage where I was expected to share my wife with another man. It baffled me that she thought I'd ever be okay with it. But I wasn't here to argue anymore. "I've thought a lot about the things you said to me," I added, softening my voice slightly. "As much as they hurt, I've started to move past them. I've made real changes. I'm not the man you dismissed so easily when you ran off to be with Liam. Her shoulders stiffened at the name, but I pressed on. In fact, I've started seeing someone. After we finalize this divorce, you're free to give all your time to him, or whatever life you choose. But I think it's time we end this, especially for the kids. They deserve a chance to heal, to rebuild some kind of relationship with you. That was when Tanya broke. Completely. She burst into tears and fled the room, sobbing uncontrollably. Julia sat stunned, blinking as if she hadn't expected that level of emotion from Tanya. I didn't either. After a pause, Julia cleared her throat and said she wanted to meet with Tanya alone next time, and follow that with a solo session for me. I agreed without hesitation. Months ago, when this whole thing exploded, I was angry, furious. I wanted to see her hurt the way I was hurting. But now, I just felt tired. It wasn't just destroying me, it was wrecking her, her parents, and most painfully, our children. I just wanted the pain to stop. When I sat down for my final session with Julia, it felt like a weight had already lifted. Tanya wasn't there. The end of counseling was in sight, and I was more than ready. Eric, Julia began with a calm but firm voice, I want to acknowledge how composed and patient you've been throughout these sessions. I know this hasn't been easy. I nodded, not really sure what to say. After meeting with Tanya last week, I feel like I gained some much-needed clarity. Do you remember the homework assignment I gave you? I nodded again, though the memory was foggy. I hadn't given it much thought. There was one question in particular that stood out, she said, pulling 2 sheets of paper from her folder. It asked, if you could change one thing about yourself or your relationship, what would it be? I leaned in slightly, brow furrowed. You wrote, I wish I had been a better husband so my wife wouldn't have fallen out of love with me, Julia said gently. I nodded, swallowing hard. When Tanya read that, she broke down, Julia added. I've never seen her so emotional. It took a long time to get her composed again. I sat quietly, unsure what to do with that information. Eric, she said softly, your wife never stopped loving you. A bitter chuckle escaped before I could stop it. That's why she climbed into bed with another man? Out of love for me. Julia exhaled slowly, visibly disappointed in my tone. Tanya is going through a severe midlife crisis, she explained. With the kids growing up, she started losing her sense of identity. Tanya's always been a caregiver, and Liam gave her a new purpose. She confused that desperation to feel needed with something deeper. That doesn't make it okay, but it does explain it. Maybe, I said. But she still made the choice. She still destroyed what we had. She's not with Liam anymore, Julia revealed quietly. That stopped me. What? She didn't tell you because she assumed it wouldn't matter. Liam left town the same day you told Tanya you were dating and finalizing the divorce. She believed she'd already lost you. I stared at the floor for a moment, absorbing that. But Julia was right. It didn't change anything. Too much damage had been done. I was finally moving forward, and there was no rewinding that tape. What did matter was Tanya and the kids. Chloe's grades had tanked. Noah had withdrawn. Even Eric, stoic, responsible Eric, avoided mentioning his mother entirely. She needs to be their mom again, I said quietly. That's what matters now. Before ending the session, Julia handed me a sheet of paper. This is Tanya's response to the same question, she said. I unfolded it. In Tanya's handwriting, if I could change one thing, I wish I had never met Liam Granger. The divorce was finalized shortly after. Tanya was granted visitation on Wednesdays and Fridays. At first, our interactions were stiff, cold nods, brief exchanges, everything filtered through the kids. But over time, something shifted. We shared the occasional meal. Sometimes she stayed longer to help with dishes or check in on the kids' schoolwork. Then one evening, after dinner, as we packed up leftovers, Tanya hesitated. Eric, she said, her voice tentative. Would it be okay if I stayed the night? I smirked. No, Tanya. The spare room's a mess. You're better off going home. She nodded, embarrassed. As for Liam Granger, eventually I learned the truth. His wife hadn't died in a tragic accident, like Tanya claimed. She'd caught him cheating and sped off in a fury. The crash wasn't random. And as for Liam himself? Poetic justice came a few months later in the form of a bar fight. He left that night with 5 broken ribs, a shattered kneecap, half his teeth missing, and most notably 2 crushed testicles. Tanya slowly mended things with the kids. Noah warmed up the fastest. Chloe came around in her own time. But Eric? He never fully let her back in. He was kind, polite, but distant. That wall never came down. 3 years later, I remarried. Her name was Rachel. She had been Chloe's teacher. And over time, she became so much more, an anchor for me, a friend to the boys, a second mother to the kids. Tanya never fully accepted that I'd moved on. She lingered in that space between remorse and resentment. But as I told her once, and only once, the discussion was over. She could either accept it, or she couldn't.